We should not remotely be surprised that Boris is planning some sort of comeback at the moment. He had said when he left Parliament, his last words were "hasta la vista," and then he also, in his closing speeches, his resignation speech, he made reference to Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a dictator, and I think Boris would do well to remember that fact about his hero, who left the plough to fight a war against a common foe who he subjected. He forced them to walk under the yoke, these spears which were erected so that soldiers had to pass under the spears, under this very small doorway, and be humiliated. That was one way that the Romans found to humiliate their enemy in the past. Later on, of course, they simply fed them to lions or crucified them. Now, Cincinnatus was a dictator. He was not a terribly successful politician initially. He's famous for accepting the will of the people to come back as dictator, take over the reins of power, win the local war, and then immediately after 16 days he went back to his farm and back to doing his job. But before that, he got into a lot of trouble because his son, Caeso, from whom perhaps Caesar takes his name, but Caeso was extremely opposed to any efforts by the plebeians to codify the law. So there was a thing which was called the Terentilian law, which was, I suppose, was a sort of Roman version of Magna Carta, and Caeso, or Ceso, however we want to pronounce his name, was opposed to this and got into quite a fight about it. So much so that he fled the country and went indeed to the enemies, to one of the enemies at the time. This is back in 458, 460 BC. And as a result of this, he was condemned to death in absentia, and his father, Cincinnatus, was fined in a huge way. And Cincinnatus just took it all on the chin and continued farming. Went back to the plough, continued farming. So when he was asked to take control of the army which had got into trouble, he did so. He left his plough. 16 days later, he was back on his farm. And that is why he's applauded. Now, in fact, the squabble, the confrontation, which necessitated the appeal for his help, was to do with Frascati, not the wine, but the region. It wasn't a squabble about wine. And as I say, once it was over, it was over. But although there was a crisis in 458, there was apparently another crisis in 439, so some years later, and we simply do not know how long it took to resolve that crisis. But again, Cincinnatus was persuaded to relinquish his plough and to go back into public office. And the implication is that he did the same thing, that he sorted matters out and then went back to his farm. But we don't know how long that took, and we don't really have any details. So it is probable that that was perhaps not quite as speedy. I don't think Boris is in any way Cincinnatus. Boris's first tenure as Prime Minister was not as brief as 16 days. Now, Liz Truss could claim to be Cincinnatus if she'd actually managed to achieve anything in her 44 days of office. But she's achieved nothing. She will simply go down as a disaster. I was going to say dignified by, but I should not dignified by, crushed by Kwasi Kwarteng's imponderable package.